Okay, so first of all, thank you for setting this up. It's always a pleasure to talk to groups of very smart people about this, one of my favorite subjects of all time. And it's kind of especially significant to talk to a group there mostly at UC Santa Barbara, because UC Santa Barbara had a significant role in my own education, my own career in this. I was when I was a graduate student at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago in the early 80s, UC Santa Barbara hosted a conference that was, that I flew out to Chicago just to see, because it became the first opportunity I had to meet Albert Hofmann. Of course, you know, the discoverer of LSD and psilocybin. And that was the beginning of a long relationship, a long and important relationship I had with that really great man. And not only did I meet Albert there, but I think that was also the first time that I met Terence Mckenna. It was, I don't know if you guys are aware of this meeting, probably you are, in 1983 it was, I'm pretty sure it was February 83 maybe. And Alexander Shulgin, who I had already met, was there with Terence and Albert. I believe Ralph Metzner spoke, but it was really something, and it was a significant inspiration for me in what became a really long and interesting career in understanding what these drugs were, what they're doing in our culture, how we can use them for the betterment of ourselves and for human society. And I really spent a lot of time in this. Now, you know, there are so many ways to go. There are so many things to talk about psychedelic drugs, as you know. You know, I first wanted, when Nellie asked me to do this, to have it really be an open discussion, to just kind of say a few provocative things at the beginning, and then, you know, engage your curiosity and talk like this. I'm still a little uncomfortable in trying to get used to, because I've been doing more of these kind of Zoom and podcasts where, you know, here I am sitting in my room in Northern California, and I can't really see you guys. I can't see your eyes. I don't know where you are. I don't know what you're responding to. I don't know who you are. I don't know what your own personal interests are in this subject. And, you know, for me, after many years, really covering the whole spectrum of inquiry, I've come to regard psychedelics as a kind of, mostly as a, like a spiritual secret tradition. You know, you probably know of the Upanishads, right? A body of writings from ancient India in around, you know, 500 BC or so. But maybe you don't know the meaning of that word Upanishad in Sanskrit, which means to sit near. It means that the student would sit near the teacher, because what the teacher was saying was meant for that student at that time, not for somebody else. And maybe it would be a different teaching for the same student at another time. But now we're in this period in our culture where these, you know, very, very powerful drugs are being broadcast kind of almost indiscriminately to the society. And there's, you know, there's a lot of benefit to that, but there are a lot of there are a lot of things that happen that are not beneficial. And so anyway, this has become my orientation. I'll tell you just a little bit about my own personal history and how I got to become this scholar of psychedelics. I was born in 1956, and I was a little young when the first wave of this happened in our society, right? I was just like a young teenager in the 60s. I was more into Little League Baseball than I was into anything very mystical, although I did have a natural mystical experience when I was very young. But I saw these drugs come into the northern New Jersey suburb where I was growing up. And my first reaction to them was alarm, because because what I saw was my friends who got involved with them early in high school became, from what I could tell, deranged by them. And I'm thinking of one person in particular who was my good buddy, and we used to play in the woods, and then he got interested in psychedelics, and that led to other drugs, and it really kind of spun him out, and he became kind of deranged by them for a period. And I vowed really in those early years that I was never gonna go near these drugs. You know, throughout high school, I was interested. I used cannabis kind of regularly, but these stronger drugs, you know, the mushrooms and LSD, I considered quite dangerous, and I warned people about using them. It wasn't until my third year of college that I was at Columbia University in New York, and I became interested in mystical experience and in meditation, particularly. And I was curious. Meditation changed my life when I got into it. I could study better. I was more grounded. I was more confident, and I was very curious. Like, who came up with meditation? How did these ancient people in India, you know, thousands of years ago, derive these very simple but very profound psychotechnologies? And so I took a course in the history of Indian religion, and my professor told us in the first day of class about the Vedas. Now, the Vedas, you may know, are the oldest body of writing in Indian literature, Indian religion. And the oldest of this body of writings is the Rig Veda. And that's mostly about a ceremony, the ceremonial collection and preparation and consumption of a drink called soma. And soma provided these mystical experiences into the nature of reality and humans' place in the cosmic scheme. And the professor told us that, you know, we wondered, like, well, what was this thing? And the professor shared with us that the leading theory, the most accepted theory at that point, was that of an amateur scholar, actually a Wall Street banker named Gordon Wasson, who had done extensive research into this phenomena and came up with a theory that soma was a certain species of hallucinogenic mushroom. And that was shocking to me. First of all, it was shocking that it was a Wall Street banker. And second of all, that it was a mushroom. And here I was for all these years thinking that these were, you know, trivial, deranging things. And now here I am, you know, in my third year of college, and I learned from this respected, esteemed professor that these mushrooms may have figured in the origin not only of meditation and yoga and so forth, but in the origin of religion in general. And so a light went off in my little brain, and I thought, wow, I've overlooked this. And I was very curious, and I went right after class. I remember I went across campus to Strand's bookstore on Broadway, and I looked through and I found some books, and there was a book by Alan Watts, The Joyous Cosmology, with a preface by Timothy Leary, who at that point I'd known about him because he was such a celebrated figure in the 60s, but I was of the opinion that he was just like a dangerous sort of fellow, a crazy, you know, cockamamie Harvard professor. You know, he was the brunt of jokes. I remember a George Carlin joke about Timothy Leary's brother, really Leary. And then so here I was now going through this change. Here's this book by Alan Watts and Leary writing the preface. And so I devoured that book. And in fact, for the next several weeks and months, I devoured many books, and this just thirsty curiosity about what were these substances, and what could they do for us, and how could they expand our understanding of the mind. And so it just around that time, I decided it's time for me to leave New York, and I moved to California to finish my degree at the University of California, Santa Cruz campus, where I was very lucky, I guess, or fated in some way to enroll in a graduate course in personality assessment with a man named Frank Barron. Now, I'm gather from just the brief introduction I've had with some of you that you're familiar with psychedelic history enough so that you probably know a number of the really significant figures when I mention Leary or Wasson, or, we'll talk about Ken Kesey. But Frank Barron is a name that probably you don't know. And if I was here in front of an audience, I would ask you, like, how many have ever heard of Frank Barron? And I bet very few would raise their hands. But Frank Barron was one of the most significant characters in the first wave of the modern psychedelic story, because he was Timothy Leary's best friend. He initiated Timothy Leary. He persuaded Tim to take the mushroom for the first time in 1959. And it was, we all kind of think, many people think that the Harvard project, that controversial project at Harvard, the psilocybin project with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass. But it was actually Frank Barron who started that project with Timothy Leary. And after a couple of years, it started to get too outrageous for him. And Frank left to go back to Berkeley and resume his career. And he became one of the most distinguished personality psychologists of our time, especially interested in the psychology of creativity and what made creative people, artists and creative scientists and architects and everything, different from the normal personality. And so Frank was really disappointed at what happened at Harvard with Leary, at getting to be such a flamboyant and controversial project. And Frank really felt that something very great was missing, that there was a tremendous potential to these substances, and hoped for that there could be a resumption of research. His friend had become so controversial, and it provoked this repression that we see in government and in the academy. And Frank wished that this could be released. And so he really encouraged me, he kind of really appointed me and it gave me an idea for what to do with my graduate school career. And so in 1981, the year that I graduated, he prompted me to organize a conference at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which was, and I did it, and it was one of the first times in about 6 or 7 years that psychedelic researchers came together to start to talk about, what to do and how to respond to the government's repression. The drugs kind of came into the culture in the late 50s, early 60s, throughout the 60s, but all this sensational stuff going on. But by the mid 1970s, they really sort of petered out, and there was this psychedelic, kind of dark ages, people say. Can I switch that so I'm not looking at myself and looking at one of you guys? And so this meeting in 1981, I'm trying to change the screen here.
Yeah, you can put it back.
How?
Or no, I'm talking to the host.
Yeah, we'll leave it at gallery.
Put it back to where it was. And so I organized this conference, and anybody who had done any significant work in the field up till that point came. I was still rather a newcomer. I'd only had a handful of experiences with LSD and psilocybin, all very interesting and profound. But here I was introducing, Timothy Leary and Stanislav Grof and Alexander Shulgin and Terence Mckenna and Oscar Janiger is another guy we may get to talk about. And it just really blew my mind, the enthusiasm and the sense of awe and appreciation for these drugs and the potential of them for so many applications in society that that I decided to devote myself to the subject. Stan Groff invited me to go down to Esalen to be his assistant and like his TA with his workshop and his workshops. And we were developing the holotropic breath work. And it was a very, very exciting year. And then I went to the University of Chicago to study with Mircea Eliade and other great scholars there to learn more about just the nature of the sacred and the profane, and the role of sacred plants in history, and trying to learn the necessary methodologies to articulate the significance of these things. And so as I was approaching it kind of as a scholar, I was also involved in some really interesting and fun underground work at the time. I was turned on to MDMA by an associate of Timothy Leary. That was really amazing. At that time, this was a substance that no one had heard of. It wasn't illegal. And it was very, very impressive to me. And I thought that it was the perfect drug to use to help reintroduce this subject, because it had psychedelic effects, but unlike LSD and psilocybin, it didn't just assault you with mystical or unconscious material. It was very gentle, and it was kind of an intermediate psychedelic. And so it was really fascinating to me. And then, I went up and met Alexander Shulgin and told him how interested I was, and how I wanted to make a career out of psychedelics, and could I get some more MDMA from him? And he laughed and he said, no, I couldn't do that. But after we spoke for a little while, he said, but I can teach you how to make it. And so I went back a short while later with some friends of mine with PhDs in chemistry, and we set up a laboratory in the chemistry department at UCSC and started producing MDMA. It was legal. We produced, pharmaceutically pure MDMA for like a $500 investment. We made like a kilo of the stuff. And so I went around over the next couple of years, again, kind of a secret society model, because we wanted to keep this drug from becoming very popular. This was, those of us that were involved in this subject back then, we didn't want to repeat the errors of the 60s. We wanted to, and the error of the 60s was, Leary's exuberance and in your face and encouraging everybody to take this stuff. And just standing on the rooftops and shouting, like, hey, these are the greatest things in the world. And that drew a lot of people to them, and a lot of people who were not prepared for them, and also freaked out the establishment. And, parents who sent their kids to Harvard are now meeting this professor, and they're telling them to take drugs. And it was all, a big, big show. And so we wanted to not repeat that and keep this as a secret, sacred substance. And we had circles of people that were doing it. We wanted to build a base underground, demonstrate psychotherapeutic efficiency. And it was a very, very creative and fruitful time. I have a lot of respect for that drug. But unfortunately, the drug, like LSD, kind of escaped from our control. I'm going to mention the name Rick Doblin here. Many of you may know that name as the founder of MAPS, which some people think is, doing such great work in psychedelic research. It's not exactly how I feel about it. Rick was the only person of several hundred people who were turned on in my project. We turned people on with the, we'd say, we're going to give you this substance. We want you to just write about what it does to you. Do not talk about it outside of that. Everybody kept that secret, except for Rick Doblin, who not only didn't keep the secret, Rick called the media. He called the government. He called President Reagan's drug czar, Carlton Turner, to basically snitch us out and to let everyone know that there was this secret love drug that therapists and people were using in Northern California, centered at the Esalen Institute. And he brought a lot of attention to this, and was one of the main reasons that MDMA became illegal. And he kind of, inserted himself into what was a secret tradition and kind of appointed himself this new ambassador, and made a lot of people very, very angry. And just a few months after that, the DEA, he wasn't the only one. There were other instances where MDMA was becoming popular and commercialized and sold over the counter in bars in Texas. And it went, in just a very short time, it went from being an underground substance of great benefit to everybody that used it, I dare say. I mean, again, I had hundreds of volunteers, many more people who were using it in therapeutic context or spiritual context. We didn't have any bad effects at all. And then it went, all of a sudden it became like from 1984, when it was still fairly secret, to 1986 and 7, it became like the most popular recreational drug in the world. And the purity began to shift. It became illegal. People entered it for commercial reasons, just to sell drugs for trivial pursuits. And it's very unfortunate. And Rick went on to, start the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which, seems to be an effort to kind of correct the problem that he's caused. And that's a whole other subject. So, so I worked with, during this year, these years, it was a magical time for me. It was just coincidences, if you're taking these substances in a respectful way, it opens up dimensions of consciousness that are, ineffable, and things happen, synchronicities happen. You get into kind of timeless realms. It's magical. It's genuinely magical. And I was having a ball. I was meeting, there was no place to go study psychedelics. You had to, in those days, what I did was I'd pick up the phone, and, a researcher that interested me, a fellow, like I mentioned before, Oscar Janiger, who was a psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, who did some really creative and interesting research with lots of celebrities and creative artists in Los Angeles. Like we all know, Cary Grant was a subject, and Jack Nicholson, and a lot of people, and Oz had administered it to hundreds of people. And so I went and became his student and lived at his house and went through his archives. And I said, Albert Hoffman. I spent a little time in the Cambridge, Massachusetts area. My girlfriend at the time was doing her graduate work at Harvard. And so I started a few fires there. I introduced the Harvard Medical School to MDMA. I organized a symposium at the Harvard Divinity School to talk about how these drugs might advance our understanding of the mystical experience and help us in religious studies. And there I got to meet Robert Gordon Wasson, who is one of the most significant figures in this area. And so like that, it was all really quite something. And then, by the middle or end of the 1980s, I became a father. This had now become quite illegal. And so I decided to kind of withdraw a little bit from the field and just watch this show, begin to unfold. And so that's a little bit of me. I am fascinated by this thing. I heard one of you mention it when we were just introducing ourselves, the Psychedelic Renaissance. We're in a period of Psychedelic Renaissance. This is unprecedented in history, that these, and it's just astonishing to me, really, to look at the differences between the media coverage that psychedelic drugs got in the 1970s and in the early 1980s, when this war on drugs was starting, because these were, these were terrible things. There was never any positive press about, the research that had been done with LSD and the treatment of alcoholism, or the value of LSD in neuroscience. It was all just very, very repressive, hostile media climate. And when you look at what's going on today, it's completely the opposite. I mean, we're just flooded with media. I'm tuned in, so I see it every day. But even a normal viewer, you see these articles about, on CNN or in The Economist about the value of microdosing LSD, or LSD can make you a billionaire like Steve Jobs, and this like wholesale endorsement, advertising of psychedelic drugs. And I find that really extraordinary and remarkable, and maybe we're going to get into that. So I titled this talk here, Psychedelic Movements of the 20th and 21st Century, because I think we need to look more carefully at the history and the sociology of psychedelics. And one of the things that I've been saying and writing about, that, we have this phrase, the psychedelic movement. And I think that's misleading, because although there's one family of drugs, we can more or less agree on what a psychedelic drug is. It's not a hard and fast category, but we know what they are. They're psychedelic drugs. There's a family of them. But there are many, many very, very different psychedelic movements or psychedelic communities, or people that use these drugs, that are fascinated by these drugs, that are diametrically opposed to each other, with wildly different intentions and applications and effects. And so I wanted to begin a conversation about these different perspectives and these different movements, so that the student can identify what's going on and make sense of themselves, for themselves, what's happening here and what direction they want to go in. And so just a little while ago, I was sitting out by the cliffs, and I jotted down a few of what I think are the psychedelic movements, right? Okay, so first of all, and many of you that I met at the beginning are into this. It's a neuroscientific movement. When Albert Hofmann discovered LSD in 1938 and 1943, it was a kind of two-part discovery. It really set off a kind of revolution in neuroscience about how the brain works, to process signals and interpret reality. And it gave us, it was a boon to the understanding of serotonin. It led to tremendous pharmacological breakthroughs in antidepressants. It was hugely successful and significant in understanding mental illness. You probably know the first model that was used here was called psychotomimetic, because they first thought that LSD caused a mimicked psychotic experience, and so we could understand the neurology of psychotic states. So that was very, very big. That's one thing. That's the neuroscientific movement. At the same time, Albert Hofmann took it and reported to his colleagues at Saunders. He also had what he thought was like a mental breakdown, had gone crazy, but he also, another part of it was a rebirth. It was a very profound mystical experience that he had, and that he had a very philosophical sense about it. And so he gave the LSD to his scientific colleagues at Saunders, but he also kept some and began to take it with his philosophical and literary friends and community in Switzerland at the time. And so that's a whole nother tradition or movement, just call it meta-psychiatric or philosophical or or metaphysical movement. It is also learned early on that these profound experiences had psychotherapeutic value. So there was a real dramatic uptick in using psychedelic drugs to enhance psychoanalytic explorations of the mind. And that's continued for a long time. There's also, let's see what else I jotted down here. And this is a subject that is difficult and controversial, and one that currently interests me the most. Is the sort of difficult to look at, painful perhaps, understanding that these drugs were first administered to contemporary society in a social engineering program by kind of anti-humanist forces in the CIA and other secret societies. You know, there's psychedelic drugs have been kind of branded as being humanistic and expanding consciousness, and they're going to help us in war and things like this. But in fact, they were administered in a vast mind control enterprise known as MKUltra, and the extent and significance of MKUltra is really just starting to dawn on researchers. There's been what is known as a limited hangout. The CIA has admitted some of their more nefarious and devious applications of LSD to unwitting subjects. You've read about this stuff, I'm sure, in books like Acid Dreams and A Terrible Mistake and Storming Heaven, you know, and but that's really just the tip of the MKUltra iceberg. In fact, most of the documents that described the MKUltra program have been destroyed. We really only know a small bit, and it's my studied opinion that this MKUltra project is not only more extensive, but it is in full force today. Okay, so that's huge and interesting, and I think if we want, we can return to it. So it's kind of ironic, but an interesting part of this history, that although they were first applied to American society to control human society, it kind of backfired a little bit, and that's mostly through the person and the ministry of Timothy Leary, who was originally recruited and used by the CIA as a Harvard faculty member, very charismatic and brilliant, handsome, charming guy who was recruited to popularize psychedelics. He learned in the early 1960s that he was being used by the CIA, and he didn't like that. He had a real anti-authoritarian aspect to him. And so he and Frank Barron kind of teamed up to figure out how to use these substances against the authoritarian kind of menace that was spreading through American society in the 50s and early 60s. And so that's where we get completely opposite psychedelic movement, where really they were used as change agents to try to, you know, excite a broader view of nature and the human personality. And then Tim suffered for going against his handlers in the CIA, and they kind of backed off of the operation for a number of years. Tim got put in prison, and his character assassinated. And I mean, it was easy to do because he was a very reckless guy to begin with. But you know, the kind of official story about how Tim blew the research, if you've read Michael Pollan's book, you know, that he takes a shit on Timothy Leary whenever he gets a chance, and all these researchers today say, oh, this was such a valuable subject, until Timothy Leary entered into it. And then, you know, the government had to make these drugs illegal because people were associating with anti-war movements. And, you know, I don't know how that makes sense, but That's the official story, that Tim blew it for everybody. What Tim really did, and he says this in his own writings, is that, he thinks that the best thing he did was wrestle the drugs from the CIA and give them to the people so that we could figure out what they were doing, to wrestle them from institutional control. I'm going fast here, but these are just broad strokes. Okay. Another aspect of this subject is what I would call, I alluded to it earlier, the mystery school model, where these substances, when properly used, can initiate one into religious mysteries. And there's within each of these movements, there's a methodology, there's a set of understandings. If you want to really do neurochemistry, you really have to learn a lot of math and scientific methodology and so forth. Same as if you're going to do psychotherapy. Well, it's the same with mysticism. And as one of my teachers, Houston Smith, used to say, that mysticism is not democratic. And what's right for one person might not be right for another. And so the mystical model is a real inner esoteric model where it's not a lot of show. It's not a lot of you're not really out there with it. You're in there with it, if you know what I'm trying to say. And that's distinguished today. What we're seeing a lot of, and I'm critical of this, is the next and most popular today psychedelic movement, or what I call the Psychedelic Profiteers. There are articles about, the investment opportunities. I read an article yesterday about this guy, Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, who not only wants to patent his own form of synthetic psilocybin, but he wants to patent the context that psilocybin can be administered in psychotherapy, like, dimly lit rooms and hand-holding and a kind of intimate sort of context that the psilocybin guide has with the client. And he's got a patent application to try to control and own all this stuff. And there are many other examples. Rick Doblin is one who I would put squarely in the psychedelic profiteer camp, right? And so these are just kind of, I mean to put these out to be provocative and to share my point of view. And now I'd really like to hear what, like who you are. I don't know how many people are out there hearing me. I only know where a few of you are coming from. I'm not even sure about the logistics and how we can coordinate a discussion, but that's what I want to, let's see if we can do that now. So I notice there are lights flashing here about people. Are these questions or?
Yes, I believe Dustin has a question.
Hi, yeah. Earlier you were talking about how before in like the 80s and 90s, all of the information about psychedelics was so heavily stigmatized, but now it's so different. And I only started getting into them like when the psychedelic renaissance was starting. So what do you think has changed between then and now?
You mean why has the media changed?
Why is it more positive now?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And I think that there are several reasons, but when I put on my hat as a conspiracy theorist, that's a phrase that is sometimes used in a denigrating way, not to me, but I think that when you look at virtually all of the significant participants in this psychedelic renaissance, you will notice that they have intelligence connections. And I believe that this MK Ultra operation is being revved up again. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that, well, let's go back to Aldous Huxley. Okay, Aldous Huxley was one of the really important scholars and writers in this field, and he's written, he's written many books, but there are three most significant books on this topic. The first one, perhaps the most significant, is Brave New World. And Huxley writes this novel in 1938 about a future society where very small number of power is concentrated among a very small number of people, and it's a pyramid, and the most of the people in the society are politically oppressed. They are economically oppressed. They live in little tiny cubicles, while society's leaders live in these, spacious mansions, and yet nobody rebels. They all just kind of go along with this. Why do they go along with this? Well, because in Huxley's novel, whenever they get a little restive about their predicament, they're told to go on a holiday called a soma holiday, where they take a drug called soma, very different than the soma I mentioned before, which was an awakening drug. This soma in Huxley's novel was a drug that was like a psychedelic drug. I mean, psychedelic drugs weren't even really known at this point, but this was a drug that made you feel like everything is okay, even when everything is not okay. And you not only went on a weekend to trip out on this soma, but you also were encouraged to have like frequent random sex, not love, not intimacy, but just fuck your brains out. And who wants to have a revolution, on Monday morning after you've just come back from what is, when you think about things like Burning Man or these festivals. And so that was Huxley's what he first put out, it was kind of put out as a warning. And then Brave New World is, hugely popular book. Not as popular is an addendum he wrote in 1958 called Brave New World Revisited. And I would encourage everybody that's interested in this aspect of the subject to read that, just that 20-page essay where Huxley says, I wrote Brave New World back in 1938 about a society that was hundreds of years in the future, but it's actually happening a lot faster than I thought it would. And these new psychedelic drugs and cannabis, this is the soma. And so this is maybe a long answer to your question, but I think that the media is cooperating with a social engineering scheme to distract and sort of anesthetize a potential dissident population and distract them from political and economic developments that have been proceeding kind of rapidly in the post-war period.
Sorry, but we have a lot of people with questions. It'd be helpful to be, I suppose, a bit more direct with each question. Would that be okay?
Okay, sure.
All right, next we have Robert.
Is it possible for me to see the questioner when they're coming?
Hey Bob, it's Rob. So my question would be, is something that came to mind recently that I kind of was turned on to was there was an Italian mystic and philosopher named Julius Evola, where he was a part of this Italian mystic fascist movement.
Yeah.
And they had this whole mystic fascist school where they were training like these future leaders and Ubermensches and stuff like that. Do you think that could all be connected to this sort of like, I don't know, like a connection between this sort of like elitist Brave New World mentality that you assert with the whole like CIA MK Ultra sort of thing?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I want to refer you, if you don't already know, to the work of a friend of mine and a colleague, Alan Piper, Piper. Are you familiar with that name or his writings? No?
No, I haven't
Okay,
checked out Alan Piper.
So jot this down. He's written extensively about this, a paper called Strange Bedfellows, more than a paper, a small book, Strange Bedfellows, where he gets into exactly that. He talks about the very right-wing aspects of the European esoteric tradition and their role. I think you're going to find that extremely fascinating. Look at all of his stuff. Strange Bedfellows, one of his papers. He wrote another really fascinating story about, it's called The Mystery of St. Peter's Snow, which is a, I know I'm supposed to be briefer with the questions, but this is really important and interesting. We all know that LSD was discovered by Albert Hofmann in 1938 and 1943. That's the official story. But actually, there's a novella, that was published in Germany in the 1920s by a German occultist. And it was about German scientists who were researching ergot to find the mystical molecule in ergot so they could release it into society and start a kind of faux religious movement. Okay, so this is like the almost exact same beats of LSD's discovery, but it predates LSD by 10 or 15 years. And so Alan has written extensively on this. And yeah, I think that there is something to that. Also, I mentioned my my professor, Mircea Eliade, who was, I believe, associated with Ebola, and a curious book that he wrote called Youth Without Youth, which may also bear on this. So, okay. Somebody else.
Next will be Brett.
Just really quick, actually. So it is just really quick. Sorry. So it is already 6 o'clock and people might start leaving slowly. Is there any way for people to reach out to you, or the best way for people to reach out to you, maybe like an email or something like that?
Well, yes. I'm still living, my computer and all my stuff was destroyed and my house burned down this summer. I haven't set up a website yet. I do have a presence on Facebook. I'm almost embarrassed to say that, but I got on it a long time ago, and I keep a running discussion there. So you're welcome to come find me on Facebook. You're also welcome to converse with me privately. I'll give you my email address here now, okay? It is RPF, as in Robert Paul Forte, RPF at got.net, GOT.net. And then I'll be happy to converse with you there. Okay.
Hi there. Thanks very much for being with us. I like the way your words are steering our attention, and in particular to the impact of psychedelics on our consciousness of the natural world, the natural environment. And in my mind, the only real evolution of our consciousness is to realize our interconnectedness with all the life around us. So I just wanted to invite you maybe to speak a little bit about that, how that has transformed human consciousness and understanding of the natural world.
Yeah, that's a big question, and thank you for asking it, because I think that when I first got interested in the subject, that was one of the most important things for me, is the unitive experience. That I feel that we are a culture that has been kind of ripped from our intimate, conscious awareness of, as you said, the interrelationship of all things. That we live in this kind of, fragmented, defensive posture to nature and to other people. And I had a very kind of idealistic sense approach that if these experiences could be, recognized and developed, be part of our society, that we would be based more on the kind of sense of wholeness and I was very lucky when I was a kid. I was like 11 years old, and I had just a natural mystical experience in nature. I was by a stream that I used to play at, and I just like fell into this trance where I was one with the wind and the water. And I was always a little different from people. And, so that when the ecology and anti-war movement started, it like made perfect sense to me, but other people were not quite so lucky. So that's a really big topic. I said that my approach, now I think of it as kind of idealistic and a bit naive, and I think of some of these people that have had mystical experiences, and they don't really have humanistic or ecological values. And we would, if we were going to continue, we just have to look at this. And in the history of mysticism, like in Buddhism, for example, mystical experiences are only valuable, after you have attained kind of prerequisite ethical and psychological discipline orientation to phenomena. A mystical experience early on in your life can be disruptive and confusing, and can give you something to be attached to. And I think actually this is one of the reasons that the CIA wanted to just turn on American society, to sort of confuse them. In fact, Gordon Wasson, who we didn't really get to, that's the very first thing he learned about psychedelic drugs, even in the anthropological literature, that the mushroom in rare instances causes, helps gifted people become healers and perceive the mysteries. But for the larger number of people, it leads to debauchery and confusion. And so, it's like that. It's not a simple thing like, hey, take a drug and you are one with everything and you're enlightened. It's not like that at all. So that's a quick answer to what could be a long conversation.
Real quick, Robert, do you have a light you could turn on?
A light? Oh yeah, it's dark here. Let's see.
Thanks.
How about that? More? That's too bright. Go ahead, another question.
Rob, if I may, this is thank you for having us on and chatting with us, sharing your experience. I don't know if it's more of a question or just a clarification. I'm curious to know. So from when I hear you talk, I hear neuroscience, I hear mystery schools. I've personally met Stan Groff a couple of times. I've done the holotropic. It has helped me only once of the two times. How do we balance? So on one hand, you have the MK Ultra, and we have all of this sort of political outward uprising. We have to participate in politics together with, for example, Groff, who uses a breathing and musical method, or Rudolf Steiner through the mystery schools. So we have an internal path to go in to learn our about our consciousness, who we are, and hopefully maybe even change our world through that process. But we also have the problem that we're facing externally with the issues of control of our own minds, our thoughts, our feelings, and actions. And so how do you how do we balance this need for looking within while acting without?
Well, that is a beautiful question. I don't know how I can possibly answer it briefly. Carefully, intelligently. There are teachers. There are, it's a life process. This is one of the things with psychedelics and the mystical experiences, that people are sort of led into thinking like they're a panacea, and I'll just microdose, or I'll just take mushrooms and I'll be fine. And then people do this and they have a hard experience, or they get confused, but they just don't have a model. But the models are available, and maybe I'll refer you to, I think one of my best contributions, because before I got into psychedelics, I was very interested, I remained so, in the history of Buddhism and the phenomenology of Buddhist practice. And so I conducted a conversation with one of my Buddhist teachers to offer a framework for psychedelic experience from a Buddhist understanding. And that's a chapter in my first book called Psychedelic Experience and Spiritual Practice from a Buddhist perspective. And so you can check that out, or I guess I can't send you a digital copy. I don't have one now, but
I'll get it on Amazon. Yeah, I'll find it.
Okay. You know, it's not like I was going to make a joke about this. I went today to get lunch, and I don't know if you can see this. Look,
Pure Love Synergy. Yeah.
You can buy Pure Love, and it's just here in this little bottle. Unfortunately, it's not that easy.
I believe the next question will be from Elliot.
Thanks. So there'll be a lot of premises in here, and if some of them are wrong, pointing that out would be a good answer to the question. I guess so the CIA seems to have found it difficult, at least, to predict the effects of psychedelic drugs in order to use them for mind control, unless maybe some of their successes not more widely known. And Soma in Brave New World seems to be much more sedating than I've found LSD to be. You don't get Steve Jobs from that version of Soma, for example, and maybe that's not the best example, but surely there are some. And so I'm wondering if you can say anything that would help me make sense of why these drugs in particular would be chosen, if that was kind of the quote unquote plan, particularly since they were given up and made illegal. Maybe that was just a political thing, though. Maybe Nixon had more clout than Gottlieb or whatever. But how could I understand this apparent change of course, and how maybe these drugs are being seen differently now than they were by people back then? How is it being steered? Is it just generally injecting chaos? It seems like it'd be a weird choice to use a drug that also has such latent potential for awakening. So just wondering how to better understand how would these be somatized, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I know I've used that word myself, somatized. Well, you're right. First of all, I believe that the CIA was surprised, and I think one of the biggest surprises for them, and one of my favorite stories in modern psychedelic history, is the case of President John Kennedy. Right. So I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but I will refer you to a book by one of my very close friends and mentor these days, Peter Janney, a book that's called Mary's Mosaic. And, John Kennedy was elected to the presidency in 1960, and he was really a kind of Cold Warrior himself. His father was a fascist, and Kennedy was going to kind of keep on with this, Cold War stuff, and he got turned on to psilocybin, and he had a mystical experience, and it helped to kind of accelerate his own development, and it seems to have caused him to rethink the whole model of nuclear weaponry. And he felt betrayed by the CIA for different activities that they were involved in, the Bay of Pigs, and became aware of really nefarious aspects of the CIA, threatened to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, was one of his lines. He began to personally relate to Khrushchev. They were going to end the Cold War. He announced he was going to get out of Vietnam. This is all within a few months or a year of his psilocybin initiation. For those that are interested in this, I will refer you to what some people still consider, I certainly do, the most important speech ever given by an American president. It is called the Peace Speech by JFK on June 11th, 1963, where he bypasses his speechwriters, he bypasses the CIA, and he announces to the world an end to nuclear testing, a détente with Khrushchev, the end of the Vietnam War. And you listen to him and he sounds like a guy that hasn't really come down from his mushroom trip. And this, I think, was really a surprise to the CIA, that these substances that they were using for their, psychotomimetic or to induce chaos, kind of backfired on them. And then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated just, a few months after that. Elliot, your question is a complex one. The CIA was just learning how to deal with this. And I think Huxley was also not an authority. He's also, they're just kind of learning, and there's a lot of just figuring it out. Huxley makes it very clear when he writes Brave New World Revisited, that essay that you can get online, that these psychedelics are the new soma. Now, one way that works, here's another book I want to refer you to. It's a book called Who Paid the Piper? And it's a book about a CIA operation known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Now, some people may be aware that the CIA also backed the modern art movement. This expressionist art that became very popular in the 50s and early 60s with people like Jackson Pollock is one of the famous examples. This style of art that's just really kind of formless and spontaneous and like, why would the CIA back this? Because what it was like a public relations kind of propaganda scheme, because it gives we all think of fascism as the Nazis, straight lines, obedient, authority, da da da. And so if here the United States, which is becoming a fascist country way back into the 50s, but they have, these outrageous art movements and eccentric sort of bohemian stuff, no one would mistake us for a fascist country. So I think that might be part of your answer. But that's a book by Francis Stonor, funny last name, but a really important text on this.
Awesome, thanks a lot.
Also, let me suggest, because another person that was hugely significant in the propagation of these drugs in the 50s was Henry Luce. So I don't know if you guys know about Henry Luce, but Henry Luce was the founder of the Time Life media empire. And he was a fascist. He was a member of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. And, the media in the 1950s, this was one of the first things that the CIA went after, is to turn the American media into a propaganda ministry. And so another book I should introduce you to at this point is a book that Tim Leary told me he thought was one of the most important books on American society. And it's a book that's titled Catherine the Great. And it's about Katharine Graham and what's known as Operation Mockingbird. And so Henry Luce and the media is turning in, like, fake news is kind of a meme these days, but the use of media to propagandize the American public goes much further back in history. So keep in mind Henry Luce. Oh, the book I wanted to recommend is called Acid Hype by a professor of journalism or media studies at the University of Wisconsin, I think, Stephen Siff, S-I-F-F. And studying these texts may help answer that question.
The next question is from Carolyn. Carolyn, I believe you're on mute.
Okay. Hey, Robert.
Hi.
We're saying hi from Bali here. Actually, you just answered my.
I can't see you.
Yeah, did you not see us? Yeah, my friend Emerald and I here in Bali. You actually just answered my question, which was asked in a bit of a different way. I'll tell you what my question was, if you have something to add to it, but you kind of answered it. My question was, it seems like the Ayahuasca culture is being tolerated and possibly encouraged worldwide. Do you believe this is also part of the MK Ultra social engineering plan? And if so, how does it play into their desires to have a controllable population? You sort of answered it a little bit with the other question, but you can elaborate if you want.
You'd have to repeat there. I missed a couple words in the beginning of the question. Could you repeat the first part?
Sure. Sorry about the sound quality. It was a question about ayahuasca, the ayahuasca culture globally. It seemed to be tolerated and even encouraged. It's not the whole movement is not being shut down anywhere that I see. So my question was, do you believe this to be also part of a ultra's social engineering plan? And how would it play into their desire to have a controllable population? Since, as it was previously said, it's very hard to control people once they find out they are the divine creators of their own reality.
Yeah.
So
if
you want to elaborate.
Yeah, it's a great question, Carolyn. I'm so glad you showed up here. Carolyn is one of my dearest friends who we're friends from California. Didn't we go to Tim's funeral party together?
You took me to Tim Leary's memorial. You took me,
Yeah.
Laura Huxley, our mutual friend, was there, and a whole host of other characters. Crazy.
Yeah.
Oliver Stone was there, completely ripped on acid.
Yeah. So your question, I want to say this because, in the last half an hour or so, we've talked about some of these, kind of dark and conspiratorial aspects of the subject. But I really want to say that that's not the whole story. And that, I love these drugs, and my ayahuasca experiences have been extremely important to me, not only, therapeutically, but just kind of religiously, and to open up into these realms. And so both things are going on here at the same time. And I did answer the question to some extent by saying that serves an authoritarian, totalitarian system because it disguises itself. Like, how could we be a totalitarian country if we're allowing this to go on? And will it backfire on them? Well, I sure hope so. And that's why I'm starting to come out more and talk more and help people to see, not to be, tricked by all the glitz in the media. And that if we are going to take an interest in experimenting in using these psychedelics, let's really do it with full consciousness.
Yeah, I have one other thing, if it's okay, if there's not a huge line behind me. Ask you, can I do this?
Yes. Yes, there is
So I've been at many psychedelic science conferences in the last 4 or 5 years. MAPS among them, and the one in Czech Republic and the one in England. I talked to Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins a lot. And so he's got the program with psilocybin, treating people who are terminally ill, and also PTSD, and making a lot of headway healing trauma, which is wonderful. But the psilocybin program needs 2 therapists for longer than 8-hour shifts, and it's because it takes so long. So I asked him, because 5-MeO DMT is so much more efficacious in such a shorter period of time in terms of healing trauma and giving us the experience that is the highest, in my opinion, the highest benefit of psychedelic drugs. And I asked him why aren't they using 5-MeO? Because they could get several more people through the system in a day with 5-MeO therapy than these other drugs, which take 12 hours, 8 hours, and they take 2 shifts of therapists. And he said it was because, and this relates to something you said about Sasha Shulgin, trying to keep the very special drugs secret for a long time so that the CIA, the government didn't Schedule 1 them. Roland told me they weren't using 5-MeO because it didn't have a long enough history of use, and LSD and psilocybin did, but that they would soon switch over to 5-MeO for therapy. do you know anything about this, Robert? Have you, like, what's the status on 5-MeO DMT?
I don't know the current status or Roland's position on it, but I have great respect and affection for Roland. I kind of helped that Johns Hopkins project in the early days. 2 of my books are used to draw attention, and all the money, not that there's a lot, goes to those projects. I once, a very close friend of mine, my girlfriend at the time, was addicted to tobacco, nicotine, tried everything to get off of it. And I gave her some 5-MeO, and I gave her a little too much because I told her it would be about half an hour, and it ended up to be about 2 weeks. But she never smoked another cigarette. And so he was fascinated by that. And no, I'm not privy to his current thoughts on 5-MeO. I don't have that much. I mean, I get it as like an initiatory device, the unit of experience. I mean, it just very, very powerful. I've seen a lot of people get kind of use it habitually, get sort of addicted to it.
Wow, how could you?
Yeah, well, no, there were people, you know, there's some real tragic stories, like Franco De Leo, who was doing the LSD research in Maryland in the early 80s. Terrible instances there. This another one of these things where they're like, you know, these neo-shamans that are just appointed themselves as, you know, to administer this stuff and giving it to people. And I caution about that one because I think it can be disorienting. But that's another big subject. See, we should have a whole course on this. We can't possibly do any justice to these issues in just this.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I'm really down for
Do it
that.
in Bali.
Actually, if I may chime in, I actually read some time ago that somewhere in the UK that they're, you know, doing some trials with DMT for treating depression. It's been a bit since I, you know, actually looked into it, but I don't know. I was a little bit critical about it, given how complex depression is and just, you know, general mental illness, and, you know, just using something like DMT just because it's a little bit faster. I don't know. I'm not totally sure about that.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that's kind of how I feel with this whole medicalization of psilocybin and DMT and LSD, is that, you know, we're a culture that loves a quick fix. You know, here we go, right? Love in a bottle. But, you know, that's not what love is. And people who are depressed, you know, that's, like you just said, Nelly, a complicated thing, but people are depressed for, you know, lifestyle reasons. Depression is a socioeconomic illness. You know, I did a little research into that a while ago, and it maybe is, you know, an effort by the power structure to, this was a word that Houston Smith turned me on to, happify a population, give them something so that they're happy, so that they don't rebel, you know, so that they just, it's soma. It's a classic example of the somatizing the society. And, you know, when I was talking with someone the other day who wanted to know if I would guide them on some psilocybin trips because they were dealing with depression. And I said, well, you know, what do you do for your depression? Like, what's your diet like? And, you know, do you exercise? Do you spend time in nature? Are you happy with your work? And they were like, well, you know, I'm not really working much, and no, I should really do that more. I was like, yeah, you should do that more. You don't just want to take a drug and still have your, you know, lifestyle issues. That depression is often a process that the drug experience can circumvent, can block the healing of. So, you know, I think we need to be just conscious of that stuff and really think intelligently about it. Okay.
Are there any more questions?
Speaking of quick fixes, what's the next GameStop? Is it MindMed or Compass Pathways?
That's right. Good one. I don't know.
Coin.
I'm very leery of that whole Compass story. I mean, how could you not be? This is a guy that he's into parabiosis, right? Drinking blood. You know, there's another. This is really dark. So I don't want this to be the last thing I say, but you know, Gordon Wasson was brought the mushroom to the attention of European Western culture and broadcast Maria Sabina's use of them as a curandera in Oaxaca. But you know, there's a whole history of the mushroom being used in Mesoamerican cultures, not for healing, but for people who were being prepared for human sacrifice were given psilocybin mushrooms, and then they were you know, their heads were cut off and they were sacrificed. So that's, you know, kind of creepy, but something to look at. You know, that's, again, my whole point in coming here today is to try to expand our view of this vast, incredibly interesting subject of psychedelics. It contains everything. It's like the history of religion, a microcosm of the history of religion. Within the history of religion, you know, we have some of the very best things that humanity has to offer. Ideas of enlightenment and ethical systems and, you know, meditation and yoga and healing strategies. You know, even the very word healing and holiness and health are etymologically related. Religion is, you know, one of the great forces in human history. But also within the history of religion, we see the very opposite, the very worst, you know, forms of mind control and superstition and justification for war and, you know, power and domination. And so psychedelics are like that too. Let's not be, you know, tricked by this, you know, advertising and get swept up in what, to a considerable extent, is a psychological operation against us. Let me recommend another book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, by John Potash, Potash. Really important book to, again, broaden your perspective. Okay.
I have one more question, and it might be the last question unless somebody else wants to ask something. But I have recently been reading Ralph Metzner's work. I mean, I've only read like 2 things of his, and so far I've been really digging a lot of his stuff. And something that he suggested or proposed is this idea of a neo-shamanic medicine circle. And it's supposed to be a hybrid between more traditional entheogenic ceremonies and Western psychiatry, but I'm looking at some of the features of it, and it seems like it's mostly sort of like an integration or a combobulation of traditional culture or traditional entheogenic ceremonies. What are your thoughts about that? Because you mentioned something about shamanic ceremonies or neo-shamanic ceremonies.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. First of all, I have had the utmost respect for Ralph Metzner, who became a really important friend, never really quite a teacher, but a colleague and a brother. And when I first got involved with this in the early 80s, we connected and we're friends throughout. I was just asked to write a chapter for his Festschrift, his memorial volume. And I encourage everybody to really study Ralph Metzner's work. And I think that his, I don't really like the use of that word neo-shamanic. I think shaman is, you know, really grossly overused, and it just, we ought to just kind of leave that word for the anthropologists and the historians of religion. You know, people calling them themselves shamans or neo-shamans, but that's what Ralph did. But I think his methodology and his consistency throughout his career is commendable. His political orientation is, I'm not going to get into the details, but Ralph is one of the very few people, myself also, that very concerned about the conspiracy around September 11th and what that means for consciousness, that Ralph lent his name to that movement. And so, you know, he's authored dozens of books and articles, and I think a serious student has to really be familiar with Ralph's work. I was really lucky because I was personally part of dozens of those circles in my psychedelic education. And in fact, I conducted many myself for a number of years, and I may resume that kind of work. I just won't call it neo-shamanic, but yeah.
Robert, this is Jeremy. So you've given us quite a few books to read, to look into, depending on what our own interests are. But what about, I know you've written quite a few things, and why did you write what you wrote? And do you suggest one more than another? Or do you have a favorite book of your own?
Okay, well, just to be clear, I haven't actually, I know that Nellie said the author of. The books that I have so far published are edited collections.
Editorials, right.
So the first book that I did, which was derived from some of the conferences that I organized, all original papers. I'm still very proud of that book, and I recommend it highly. It's called Entheogens and the Future of Religion. It's a more or less scholarly collection of writings by, you know, a lot of the very the leading people, original writings by Albert Hoffman, an extensive interview I did with Gordon Wasson, Jack Kornfield, my meditation teacher for a while. Really good book. Houston Smith, you know, one of the great scholars of religion, also a teacher and friend, said that was the best inquiry into the religious significance of psychedelic drugs. So I'm very proud of that, and I recommend that. And then the next book I did was called, was a book, a Festschrift, a memorial volume for Timothy Leary, because I wanted to, as I said in the beginning, at first I was kind of down on Tim because that's what my teachers were. But then I began to realize another aspect, not only to him personally, but to the history. And so I wanted to put a book out that would kind of, you know, again, if you read in the media, Michael Pollan's book, etc., Leary was the problem. Well, there's a lot more to it than that. And he was a problem, but he was creative and brilliant. And so I got together a lot of people that knew Tim to write about him. So that's the second book I did, which is called Outside Looking In. And that was a lot of fun. And there's some really good material in there. Long interview with Houston Smith about the religious significance and the cultural wars. A long conversation with Ram Dass. A good, really good book, and I recommend that. The third book I did was to bring back into print a book on the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries, which again, earlier I mentioned a kind of religious model or a mystery school model where we're not, you know, promoting these drugs, we're taking them, we're doing inner work, you're being silent about them. So I wanted to put that out. And now I'm currently in the process of writing my own book, which I see as it's going to be kind of a memoir, and it's going to be sort of an answer to Michael Pollan's book, which covers only half the story. And I was really in the flow with that this summer, but then this fire came and burned everything and all my records and all my stuff. So I'm kind of back to beginning that. And hopefully I'll have that done in a year. So that's my answer to that one.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I think this will be the close of this meeting. Thank you everybody so much.